Welcome to the Sports Pharmacy Network show where we dispense clinical and evidence-based information to optimize health and human performance. I'm Brandon Welch, clinical sports pharmacist and your host of the show. Today, we are thrilled to welcome back Dr. Michael Day to the podcast. So we'll kind of dive right into this, piggybacking off of our last episode. Can we truly biohack aging, or is it more about fundamental lifestyle habits?
Yeah, the term biohacking kind of makes me cringe a little bit, and it makes me not want it associated with my medical practice. I get it, and it's want something that's going to have a high degree of effectiveness with little effort, which is always great. But I don't like the connotation that you're getting something for nothing and that you're kind of cheating, that there's a cheat code for the system here. And so I tend to not even use the word biohack. But I don't discount that there may be things that are high yield interventions. And so I think biohacking is as much, a marketing term or a hype term as anything else. Unless you're going to say, lifting weights is a biohack. Um, but I think it's never tied to like those fundamental things. It's almost always has some commercial tie into it, and that's what kind of has the ick factor for me. Um, so I think you can have a clear-eyed view of any intervention and evaluate it, and it may have commercial value to the person that's marketing it, and it may have medical value to the person that's using it. But there's no free lunch, and there's no circumventing the fundamentals first.
I agree, man. Biohacking, I feel like, is just one of those buzzwords, excuse me, of aging. It sounds exciting, but at its core, longevity in general isn't about shortcuts or quick fixes. I think that it consistently applies fundamental lifestyle habits backed by science, and it's some of the things that you kind of alluded to on our first episode, such as nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management, social connection, things to note those natures. And a good parallel is oftentimes, me being a pharmacist when I have to manage a patient's medication. I always say, hey, the medication by itself isn't going to maximize its effectiveness. You have to do a combination of things, still integrate some of those fundamental lifestyle um, interventions, if you will. And so it seems like with the biohacking thing, it's like what you kind of talked about is like there's not one individual thing that is going to yield high results while dismissing some of the fundamentals such as the nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress management, and social connection. Got to walk before you run.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Now, what would you say are like some of the common misconceptions that you hear about when it comes to longevity science that need to be debunked?
I think anytime you have a focus on one thing, whether it's a supplement, which is kind of, the most frequent offender, or a practice, and, it just, things get taken out of context, and, maybe, this is good for you to do, but for someone to say, this is the key to longevity, and, this is, it makes for a nice soundbite, or a social media blip, but it's
Mhm.
I think does a disservice to the field of longevity. Anytime you are hyper focused on one thing, and you see it with supplements all the time. The other thing I would say is just even the notion of longevity, and what are we aiming for, and this could come down to, like we talked earlier about, like what it means to different people, and to me it's about quality of life, level of function, health span, having as much disease free state as you can before the onset of chronic disease. And to other people, maybe it means like living to 200 or even not dying, which I think is science fiction at this point. Always
Hmm.
open to revising. That's what science is about. But longevity to me is not about not dying. It's about making the most of the time and knowing that you're going to get sick and you're going to die.
Absolutely. And, there's no magic pill when it comes to longevity, right? So, you know, I often hear of people stockpiling on supplements that are claimed to, increase their lifespan, and that sometimes becomes their only focus, right? And we know that, for example, food has certain bioactive compounds that are a lot more effective than what supplements will essentially do. So I always say they kind of complement each other because they're called supplements for a reason. They're supposed to supplement a healthy diet. They're supposed to supplement a good exercise plan. They're supposed to supplement a good sleep hygiene strategy. And so when we start to kind of pull back the onion layer of all these different misconceptions when it comes to longevity science, I think it's really important to kind of consider a lot of those lifestyle fundamentals and those key factors that you've discussed on this episode and even our previous one.
Yeah, you got to keep the big picture in mind.
You got to keep the big picture in mind. That is true. And I like to say this too, like, while there is exploratory and investigational information when it comes to, for example, like hyperbaric oxygen chamber, cryotherapy, red light therapy, I think all those things could be great. Maybe there is some value to it. But when you're completely removing any of these fundamental things that we've talked about, I think that you can be doing yourself a disservice when we're trying to think about, okay, how do we actually extend or expand our health span, right? To have good good quality good quality of life, because these things can also be expensive too, Mike, as you know. They're definitely not no shortcut.
Yeah, there's an opportunity cost that's not just financial, but it's also time. And so, if you're gonna sit in a red light bed or get some IV infusion for an hour, it's like, would that time have been better spent exercising? So it's like, you know, did you exercise for an hour that day that you went to do this like fringe thing? If you didn't, then like where's the where's the priority? And like, is your fitness so dialed in that you can then and you have that much disposable time and income that you can dispose of it in that way? And then do you want to? You know?
Right. And keeping all these things in mind, right? And so when we're implementing, these different longevity strategies, or even applying some of the fundamental things that we're doing, we obviously want to quantify, right? We want some type of objective measure to see if what we're doing is working, right? And one of the things that I point to, outside of, to your point, when you mentioned, when we define longevity, it can be quality of life, functionality. Functionality is one piece, but I also like to look at someone's individual health. And so I point to blood biomarkers, and we know that there's a battery of tests that we can look at. But from your experience being a longevity physician, what would you say are your most important blood biomarkers to track for longevity and overall health?
Well, I try to take a personalized approach to testing and prescribing and formulating a plan. But that said, there are certain things that we tend to get very commonly and on almost every patient. At least certainly people that are over age 40. I don't think there's a large role for doing a lot of this testing in like much younger age groups. It can be much more intermittent or targeted there. But we're talking about like initial evaluation or annual evaluation. We're always looking at metabolic health, cardiovascular health, hormonal health, nutrient status, and, in the blood. And then we're looking at biomarkers that are not blood biomarkers, of course, as well. But the metabolic health, we're always looking at glucose disposal. Typically we're getting a hemoglobin A1C, which reflects the average blood glucose over the last 3 months. We're getting a fasting insulin because insulin usually will go up before glucose goes up because that's the body keeping the glucose normal. So that can be a canary in the coal mine. Uh, Sometimes we use continuous glucose monitor or a glucose challenge. Um, so those are probably the most basic metabolic health tests. Cardiovascular health, we're checking lipids. We're checking ApoB as the most pathogenic lipoprotein particle. Um, Triglycerides, CRP as a general marker of inflammation, but also indicative of cardiac risk. Um, and hormone levels. Males, we're looking at not just total testosterone, but free testosterone, what's bioavailable, as opposed to the total, which can be bound up by other proteins in the blood. Um, we're we're in northern latitude where vitamin D deficiency is very common. So I routinely test for vitamin D, and it's rare to find someone that's in an optimal range that lives at our latitude where around sunlight. So vitamin D, we'll check in a omega-3 index, and for muscle and bone health, then we're getting more into body composition assays. I know you had asked about blood biomarkers, and neurodegenerative disease. Sometimes we'll check an ApoE genotype. That's more of a individual discussion because that's a gene that confers additional risk for Alzheimer's, dementia, and so we usually have a discussion beforehand about that, about what does that mean if it's positive, and do they want to know that. But those are pretty common blood biomarkers that we check.
And I love how you said you take a personalized approach, right? And so if I'm 35 years old and I don't have a lengthy family history of chronic disease, you're not testing PSA. You're not testing. You're not making me do a colonoscopy. You're not making me do this whole in-body MRI scan if it's not necessary, right? Is because one of the things that I look at myself is it's like the cowboy approach, right? You don't want to shoot first and ask questions later. You want to ask questions first, right? To kind of explore and create a personalized menu of what biomarkers could be essential. If I don't have a history of dementia in my family, you're not going to run an ApoE on me, right? And it's important for our listeners to kind of understand this, is because as we've kind of discussed back and forth, Mike, is that you can really go down a rabbit hole testing a lot of different things, and trust me, if you do, you are bound to find something. But I always think about, is there clinical relevance to it? And so if I'm testing something and it comes back abnormal, is this essentially tied to some type of disease risk? If it's not, then what are we really looking at? You know, and so you've highlighted some great points there, trying to make this a little bit more personalized. Now,
Yeah,
with time,
any test in medicine, we want to know, is the result going to change management? And otherwise, sometimes we order stuff to satisfy curiosity or for an academic discussion, but we're talking about tests that can have consequences for false positives, and can be invasive. Sometimes the invasiveness is just a needle stick for a blood draw, but that's not to be dismissed as nothing. And so you need to get data that you're going to act on.
exactly. And you bring up actually a good point about false positives, and with my background, kind of working with a lot of athletes, we don't just treat numbers; we also look at symptoms, right? And so I see, a lot of elevated creatinine with some of the patients that I work with, and you know, looking at body composition and understanding how, muscle mass can easily affect those numbers, leading to a false positive. Also looking at hydration status. If your patient's coming in and they're not well hydrated, those can lead to a few false positive labs as well. And so it's really important that we, you know, do our blood biomarker testing judiciously and ask the right questions.
Yeah, some of that's take a whole body MRI for an example. If you're that's definitely a discussion that we have with the patient, because that's almost certain to show some abnormality, and then you can get started on additional testing and maybe even biopsy and treatment. You could end up treating something, say it is real, but would it have shortened your life? Maybe not. So you definitely have to know what you're getting into with some of the testing.
Now, what's typically your recommendation on how often blood work should be done?
I would say the most common interval is quarterly. It depends on disease state and metrics that we're tracking and what interventions we've implemented and how we think those interventions are, how long we think they're going to be take to be reflected in the biomarker. So, if someone has non-disease state and that, I'd say, if they're into middle age, we're going to at least test their labs once. If everything is perfect, then you probably have a pretty long interval before you would test anything again. Um, or maybe if you wanted to be fairly on top of it, I would say annual blood work is probably reasonable for anyone that's over 40. Um, but cholesterol interventions, we're usually looking at 12 weeks. Um, the omega 3 index, 12 weeks. The hemoglobin A1C is 3 months. So that quarterly blood test, if we're actively working on something, tends to work out well. If we're doing CRP and we're with that being a non-specific marker of inflammation, and we're trying to rapid fire try things to see what is affecting that, then maybe monthly, so that we're not just having someone on a gluten-free diet for 3 months just to see what it does to their depending on how often we want to turn over or try a new intervention, that may affect how often. But I would say quarterly ends up being the most common.
It's always baffled me, and granted, this is situational. It's always baffled me when physicians say, "Hey, I know your lipid panel is a little abnormal," and even though it's not abnormal to the point where you got to start them on pharmaceutical intervention, but for them to say, "Oh, I'll see you back next year." I mean, I couldn't tell you the amount of times that I've retested people quarterly. And I mean, you see lab values sometimes go up or down by 25, 50 basis points. And the reason why I bring this up is because there is so much that can happen in 365 days, yet in just a quarter. And so, in order for us to stay ahead of things and be proactive, I think testing, blood biomarkers quarterly could be very imperative if we're trying to kind of intervene early. And it's not to say everybody should do that, but if we're looking at trends, meaning last year your blood biomarkers were, even though they were normal, but they're starting to drop down or they're starting to raise, quarterly could be a good example. Or obviously, to your point, like if they're abnormal and we're putting you on some type of treatment regimen, again, we want to make sure that we're quantifying what we're doing and catching it within a decent amount of time to make sure that it's well managed. Now, I even go as far as saying even if your blood biomarkers do come back normal, every 6 months, I would still recommend checking them. Is because it's like I said, 365 days, in my opinion, is such a long time, and it doesn't give you the opportunity to kind of catch things early. And I know insurance companies may say otherwise, because if you're paying if you're paying through insurance, they'll limit you to only covering for doing your blood work for only a year. But I think that this idea of testing just annually is a little bit radical, but it could be situational, and you do this stuff case by case.
Yeah, we want to get a tighter feedback loop on the interventions that we're doing. And if you think about all the, if you're a person that's trying to be healthier, all the stuff that you do for your health in a year, it's, how are you going to know what had the effect? If you shorten that down a little bit, then you could say, okay, I'm going to focus on this. I'm gonna track my fiber intake. I'm gonna really make sure I'm hitting this target every day, and maybe I don't want to live like that for a full year of like counting my macros or reading all recording every label, but I am willing to do that for this period of time, and then I'll get this feedback, and then I'll know whether the intervention worked. And there's just when you're trying to optimize your lifestyle, there's just more than one or two or three several things that you're going to want to do in a year. And so
Oh
tighter
yeah.
feedback loop is facilitated by the more frequent testing.
Now I know we talked about VO2 max in our first episode. Would you say that VO2 max would be a part of your annual physical or general physical that you do with your patients?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, that's the most important biomarker. It just it integrates all the things that go into function and health and longevity. So we don't have a lab on site, so we're a little bit limited in that. And then some people are limited by musculoskeletal issues. They might not be able to do a max effort test. So there's a lot of like algorithmic derivatives of different VO2 max. So we often will do a submax test for someone that is has a musculoskeletal issue or some other infirmity obviously athletes we're encouraging a max effort test, and we will send them to a lab to have the the test done with the gas exchange, or if they don't want to go to a lab, we just do the 12-minute run test, which I actually did that earlier this week. I do try to get to a lab to get it tested as well, but it's so easy to just go to the track and do your 12-minute run, and then plug it into the equation. So I like to compare it and see like how it stacks up with the lab test. But VO2 max it's not just for athletes. It's for everybody, I think. It's painful to do. You gotta it's pushing your heart to the max. So it's not a fun test to do, but I encourage all my patients, and even if they do a submax test, to where I think the submax tests probably not as accurate as the max effort tests. Um, just in my own experimentation where I do all the tests and see what it comes out to. But some sort of number, and then we just repeat that whatever modality we used, try and use that same test or algorithm so that we can compare over time.
And I like how you said that this test isn't just for athletes, and we have to be very clear about that. Is because I'm sure a lot of people may think that it is a test only for athletes, but no, this is a clinical fitness test. I mean, We see it in patients that have congestive heart failure. And so, if we're looking at, okay, how is our physical fitness affecting our overall health, and we want a number to actually measure it in. I mean, VO2 max is the home run scale. It's the gold standard for clinical fitness tests. And so I always highly encourage it. I do it myself. And I'm sure you do it, Mike, as you just kind of talk to. And there's other practical ways, like you don't have to get on a treadmill and put the gas mask on and, pay $150, $200 to do it. The 12-minute test that you kind of talked about is another practical or convenient way for you to kind of measure your aerobic fitness. And so, again, I would encourage everybody to do this as part of your annual physical. Feel free to ask your doctor about it, and I hope that they don't look at you any type of way. But take it from two educated professionals on this podcast here that it's something that's highly recommended for you to do.
Yeah, and that's a general ethos of my practice is that we can take these things from the sports performance world and translate them to the medical world and
Hmm.
use them on athletes and non-athletes alike, and that there's lessons to be learned from the sports performance, and that we just have to interpret the data in the right context, and it doesn't have to be for athletic competition. Um, so yeah, that's how I try to practice in general. It's a general practice ethos.
It's like I always tell people, we're all athletes just waiting to be discovered. We don't have to. We don't have to be defined as an athlete just because we're not competing for a gold medal. No, you just trying to be physically fit and keeping up with a healthy lifestyle, whether it be running on the treadmill, getting on a cycle bike, whatever type of physical activity you do, you can be classified as an athlete. Now we'll take away the professional that goes in front of it, but you'll still be classified as an athlete. So kind of moving on to kind of our next topic here that you know I'm sure you get a lot of questions around is what are the most evidence-backed supplements for longevity?
So